So today's subject is what is Ukraine? And we're going to spend a good deal of time on that. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end too. I want to start though with a few practical notes. The first thing I wanted to just remind you of is that the lectures accumulate and the lectures interact one with the other. So as you're listening to me talk today about Ukraine, I am in some way continuing the lecture about Marxism. I'm also in some way anticipating further lectures about Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So when you're listening to the lecture, if possible, try to remember the person you were a week ago who was listening to that lecture, and try to imagine the person you will be in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks as you're listening to other lectures. They're not, I mean, they are self-contained, but they also accumulate. And when you notice themes accumulating, then you're understanding the major topics of the class. Second practical thing is about the sequence of lectures. So if you are a student in this class, then you should just keep coming and take the midterm when we give it to you. If you are not a student, if you are an auditor, you should not show up when we are having the midterm, which is February 24th. So don't show up during reading week because we won't be doing anything, and don't show up for the midterm. I realize many of you are very enthusiastic, and I've had a lot of requests to take the midterm, but no, you may not take the midterm. I am not allowed to require my teaching assistants to grade your midterms. So don't show up on February 24th. So there'll be a lecture next week, which is going to be Why Was Communism Attractive? Then there's reading week, then there's the midterm. So I wanted to talk to you for a moment about the midterm. There will be no surprises on the midterm. I mean, no surprises if you've come to class and done the reading. It will be a series of very straightforward questions. You are expected to be able to answer these questions on the basis of what happened in this class. So there are a whole lot of other resources that you could consult as you think about how you would answer the questions. You could call your parents. You could look at Wikipedia. I see that there are some parent callers in row 2. You could consult Wikipedia. You could ask Grok. There are a lot of things you could do to prepare yourself. You would be well advised not to do those things. I mean, your parents, they love you and everything, and I'm sure many of them, or some of them love you. And some of them know something about Ukraine. And there may be even some overlap of like the ones who love you and the ones who know something about the subject. But I would advise you strongly to stick to the material that's in the classroom. The midterm is going to be very carefully constructed so that if you have done the reading and you've come to lecture, the questions will be questions that you're prepared for. On preparation, it will help you a lot if you do a couple of things. One is when you do the reading, underline it and make notes to yourself. If you make notes, like quote things for yourselves out of the reading, that will help you prepare for the midterm. You will impress the people grading your exams if you can refer to the particular bits of the reading. If you can paraphrase or, let me just fantasize for a minute, even quote from the reading in the exam, that will serve you very well. Right? So when you're preparing, prepare yourself by way of your notes, prepare yourself by way of the reading, don't overthink it. The second piece of advice is to study in groups. If you can, I'm not telling you how to live your social lives, but maybe some of you have the kinds of private lives where you interact with other people. And if you do, one of the ways you can interact with other people is that you can study together. And a very easy way to study together is to try to imagine what the questions in the midterm are going to be and then talk out the answers, right? That's one of the things I did in university. I had a friend, we went to a cafe, we wrote out what we thought the questions were going to be. We were often right. And then we outlined them together and talked about them. If you do that, it's fun. You get caffeine. You may get sweets, right? You may like improve a relationship. You may figure out that a relationship you're having can't survive the stress of studying for a midterm. That's also good things to know, because like if it can't survive that stress, like then it's not going to survive other stress, right? Okay, so I did give you relationship advice. I'm sorry. They deduct my pay when I do that. I'm allowed to do it 3 times and then they fire me. So that was like, check 1. Okay. All right. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Any questions about the midterm? Yes.
Is it going to be mostly long answers, short answer, or like a mix of both with multiple choice?
It's going to be Goldilocks. It's going to be just right. So there are going to be several questions, and you will have medium-sized answers to those questions. You will be choosing among a group of questions. So it'll probably be 2 or 3 or 4 groups, and you'll answer like 1 from each group. And that's it. That's all that's going to be. It's going to be really, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's going to be simple, and if you study, you're not going to have any surprises. Okay. Anything else? Okay, great. So, ignore that. Just listen to what I say. You're going to get another set. Don't show up on February 24th. There will be an exam. Ignore that. You'll get another schedule. Thank you. Okay. Come next week. Don't come the 2 weeks after that if you're auditing, okay? And if you're auditing, don't riot, all right? Don't riot, because this whole auditing thing is an experiment, and if you guys riot and rebel, and like, then it won't, we won't be able to do it again, okay? All right, what is Ukraine? So I'm going to start from the present, and then I'm going to start again from the past. This lecture is going to have 2 parts. In the first part, essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at Ukraine as it seems from the outside, from 3 points of view that are very relevant to this class: the point of view of the contemporary war, the point of view of Nazi Germany, and the point of view of the early Soviet Union. And then from there, we'll make a shift and go way back in time and consider Ukrainian history as history. Consider Ukrainian history insofar as it's possible outside of the narratives which seem to make it necessary to invade or exploit Ukraine, but inside the layers of experience of what we can know about Ukraine for the last actually several thousand years. So a natural place to start, and I think really the mandatory place to start, is the contemporary war. So the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine began almost exactly 4 years ago. So that is a very long period of time. It's a significant fraction of your lives. It's already a meaningful fraction of my life, which is saying something. The first Russian invasion of Ukraine began in the spring of 2014. So in some way or another, Russia has been at war with Ukraine for the last 12 years. This is a very significant moment in the history of the present world. Of course, we don't know how historians will look back at things, but I think it's not at all an exaggeration to say that this is, in terms of simple scale, the most significant military conflict since 1945. In terms of the scale of casualties, sadly, we're looking at something in the range of 2 million people killed and wounded over the course of this war. In terms of its geopolitics, it is very much, at the most superficial level, which I think is nevertheless true, a clash between an aspiring dictatorship and a flawed but nevertheless easily recognizable democracy. And the ideological difference applies to the scale of the world. It is also, I think, an ideological conflict between those who believe that empires are normal and those who believe that states and cooperating states are the way the world should look. So when I say it's an ideological conflict, I don't mean it just between Russians and Ukrainians. You can look around the world and you can find allies of Russia, countries, groups, individuals who believe that empires are normal, allies of Ukraine, countries, groups, individuals who believe that states or the rule of law or the European Union are normal. This war, though, to take a step back, this war, though, in common with other conflicts that I'm going to talk about in this class, this war very much has to do with physical resources. The only way that the Russian Federation is able to fight this war is on the basis of the sale of hydrocarbons, natural gas and oil. And in that way, this war very much reflects the current state of ecological history of the early 21st century, in which we have a larger contest between traditional forms of energy, the kinds that became normal in the late 19th century, natural gas, oil, and new forms of energy, such as wind or solar or nuclear. That is a major element of this war. If it weren't for the hydrocarbon power that the Russian Federation has, this war could not be fought, which of course isn't just about the Russian Federation, it's about the rest of us as well. Insofar as the Russian Federation can fight this war, it directly had to do with Germany deciding to purchase hydrocarbons from Russia in the years before. It directly had to do with Germany deciding it wasn't going to use nuclear energy, but instead import natural gas from Russia. And insofar as this war has been possible for 4 years, one of the major enabling factors of that has been the continuing purchases of Russian hydrocarbons. Were they to be stopped or even drastically reduced, the war would not be possible. So in this very broad way, the war reflects a resource structure, or an energy resource structure of the world. Hydrocarbons are also relevant to the shape of the Russian state. To put things in a very, very simple way, hydrocarbons are resources that are easy to monopolize. So if there is an oil gusher, I gotta talk now. Oh, you want me to use your microphone? Okay.
Please. Yeah, if you just on your lapel.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Sure thing. Okay. So hydrocarbons are resources that are fairly easy to monopolize because they come from a specific place. So if let's say there was an oil well, let's say that like one of these speakers, gushed forth in oil, and then the people in this part of the room were able to make a big circle around it, that would essentially be the Russian state. Right there. Like these people make a big circle around the oil gusher, one of them dominates all the rest of them, that's the Russian, okay. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but hydrocarbons are very specifically by their nature a kind of resource which leads to this kind of rent-seeking, monopolizing behavior because you can physically dominate the area where they come from. So most of Russian hydrocarbons come from Siberia. Most of the wealth generated from those hydrocarbons ends up in Moscow, some of it in St. Petersburg, in a classic kind of imperial exploitative relationship. That's important, though, because one of the reasons why Russia is a centralized state and one of the reasons why dictatorship is relatively easy in Russia is the presence of hydrocarbons. So again, this is a fact about Russia, but it's also a fact about the world. If the rest of us weren't dependent on hydrocarbons, that kind of structure of politics would be harder to maintain, right? So wind and solar and nuclear are much more easily decentralized and therefore harder to monopolize and therefore harder to use as a basis for one person's power. Okay, so that's taking a step back in a certain direction. Taking another step back ideologically. There's a very specific way that Mr. Putin has talked about this war as a war over the past. So I don't know how much attention you've been paying to this, hopefully none, but you may have noticed that much of what the Kremlin says about the war in Ukraine, and as a result, much of the way the media covers the war, especially at the beginning, has to do with the view about the past. I'm trying hard now not to use the word history because every view about the past is not the same thing as history, right? History is, this will be the second half of the lecture, but history has to do with taking things in order, taking things as they come, using the available sources, being ready for surprises, being open to contingency, accepting that there's a certain amount of human unpredictability. That's what history is like. But so a view of the past in which I say something happened in the year 862, which is what Putin says. Something happened in the year 862, therefore I know everything I need to know about how to govern the world now. So in particular, what happened in the year 862, according to a document which was produced several hundred years later, was that 3 Viking brothers, which is like, don't go off and found your punk band and name that right now, like wait till class is over. But the story is that 3 Viking brothers, the auditors are like, we remember punk. Everyone else is like, huh? Okay, so the story is that 3 Viking brothers came and they established some kind of political system in Novgorod, and from Novgorod, their descendants or their friends, it's not quite clear, conquered Kiev, and that was Russia. So that's the story, and since it happened in 862, it must be true forever, and that means that Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are all one country. Now, there are a lot of problems with this story. One of the problems is that the 3 Viking brothers is a standard trope. It's like from Noah and the Ark. Basically, it's always, you might have noticed this, but it's always 3 brothers. And of the 3 brothers, 2 of them always kind of vaguely like fade into the background, and one of them ends up dominating. But it's a standard trope. There are 3 brothers. If you don't know where your city came from, you just make up a story with 3 brothers, right? And so like no matter where you come from all over the world, think about the founding myth of where you're from. It's quite possible that it involves 3 brothers. 3 brothers is also a standard Viking imperial. Oh, sorry. The other part of the story is that these 3 brothers were invited. Okay. So sometimes people do get invited to invade other countries. I'm not going to say that that never happens, but in general, the invitation story is an imperial trope. So I invade you, and then after I've invaded you, I write a story about how you invited me to invade you, right? And so the Vikings did that, lots of other people do that, but that's another part of the story which is, although it's impossible to disprove, it's not very likely. Another important issue here is that we're talking about Vikings who are called Rus in the 9th century. We're not talking about Slavs or Russians. There was no such thing as Russians in the 9th century. People figured out that they were Russians in the 19th century, which is, I realize this is not a math class, but that's 1,000 years later. Russian became an identity for a large number of people in the 20th century, which is 1,100 years later. So there weren't any Russians running around in the 9th century. The people who were in charge called themselves Rus, which was the name of a Viking clan, and there was no such thing as a nation or a state. So one can go on with these critiques, but in a way, and it's important to know them, but in a way, it's all secondary. What's primary is to recognize the difference between this kind of a story and history as such. And this is a primary distinction, not just for understanding Russia and Ukraine, but for understanding the way that memory politics works in general. If a dictator can say, I know what happened a long time ago, then that dictator also has the power to say, things today should be exactly like they were back then, right? And all that stuff that happened between way back then and the present, that's messy and uncomfortable and unnecessary and wrong. And whatever it was that happened, and it doesn't matter what happened, whatever it was that happened, we now have to have a very powerful state under my personal command to get rid of all that messy detail, to clear up all those troublesome facts, to eliminate the people who remind us of those facts and that detail, to eliminate or at least to bring to heel the people who themselves are complicated and unpredictable, right? So it's not so much that the story is wrong. Obviously the story is wrong. It's not even wrong. It's rather that telling the story itself is a certain kind of exercise of power. Whenever anyone says things were ideal in the past And everything that happened between that moment and this moment is the result of troublesome outsiders, then you know that you're in the presence of a dictatorial myth. Now, that dictatorial myth so now we seem like we're in the realm of nostalgia. But are we really in the realm of nostalgia? There's a funny way in which this what appears to be nostalgic or reactionary merges with what is postmodern and contemporary. Because this idea that I, the one with the power, am the one who can tell you what happened in history, reactionary though it might seem, also works very well with a world in which nothing is really true, facts are all a matter of perspective, opinions are as good as facts, right? Because in that world, he who controls the media, he who controls the education system, is able to say, well, the only myth that's going to have any kind of currency is my myth. And if there are no facts, if there are no truths, if there's no basis on which to resist this, then the dictator is always right. And so what we have in contemporary Russia and 21st century Russia is this odd combination of the radically reactionary, but also the radically postmodern. And I think this is quite important to understand the structure of the Russian state. So in the Russian state, you have hundreds of thousands of men, mostly men, who are fighting a war, which is supposedly about bringing the 9th century back to the present. Okay? That is a wild, weird idea, bringing the 9th century back to the present, right? So, but on the one side, it seems very reactionary and that these men are fighting for this reactionary goal. On the other hand, how can they possibly believe it? What are the specific 21st century conditions under which you can get people to believe that kind of thing, right? Those are postmodern conditions in which you have a monopoly over information and in which you have a monopoly over other things. So you have a monopoly over resources. So it is true, insofar as we can tell, from prisoners of war and so on, that Russians who invade Ukraine believe some version of the story about how Ukraine and Russia were always together. But it is also true that in the Russian Federation today, it's very difficult to make a decent salary. And one of the ways to make a decent salary is to go off and get yourself killed fighting the Ukraine, for which you are paid a good salary. And also, after you are killed, as you very likely will be, your family will then be rewarded. So I hate to make the point too obvious, but this is a bit where this lecture makes contact with the Marxism lecture. Because you can understand, if you were so predisposed, this situation as a situation of alienation, in which people are radically alienated both from the resources of their own country, and the alienation is so radical that it proceeds right down to the body, which becomes the only meaningful commodity. And the most meaningful thing you can do with that commodity is actually to sell it in the sense of allowing yourself to be killed in the service of a wild idea going back to the 9th century, right? That's a very wild idea. The kind of idea which is only possible in a world in which there are oligarchs who have huge information control, right? So if one were inclined to try to imply a sort of Marxist idea to Russia, that is the way that the thing might unfold. Okay, so now what I'm doing here is I'm asking about how does Ukraine look from the important perspective of the Russian invasion, Russian invaders, those who planned the Russian invasion. And this is very significant. What I want to make sure that you note, though, is that this is a perspective, like the other two that I'm going to discuss, in which the Ukrainians themselves don't really figure, right? They are a problem. They're the thing that is to be removed. They are those unpredictable humans. They are the sources of facts. They are the thing which must not exist. And so the story from beginning to end is about how they don't exist. But insofar as you understand the negative side of this, it also at least implicitly suggests the positive side. If a modern dictatorship is about denying subjectivity and a modern war is about denying the specificities of a neighboring people, then that can help you to imagine what the opposite might be, right? So a democracy, a rule of law state, and so on, might be conditions under which people could be unpredictable. They might be conditions under which people would be able to think about their own history. Okay. Second example of how Ukraine can be seen. And again, in what I'm doing now, I'm anticipating a subject on which there will be a whole lecture later on. So some of these themes will keep repeating, and hopefully they'll clarify with lecture and then reading and then more lecture. But a very significant second example of how Ukraine is seen is the War of 1941 to 1945. So the conflict that we call the Second World War has a number of different endpoints and beginning points, depending on where you are. If you are in China, the Second World War begins in the early 1930s. If you are in Poland, the Second World War certainly begins in 1939. If you are the United States, then the Second World War begins in 1941. If you're the Soviet Union, it also begins in 1941. So when I say the War of 1941 to 1945, what I mean is the central conflict of the Second World War, which was between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, and again, this will be in the reading, and we'll rehearse it again in lecture. I just want to get across a central point here that we have another very basic example of how Ukraine is seen and how the way that Ukraine is seen is crucial to our theme, right? Like by the end of this, so, I mean, there's an overarching question in all of this, right? Which is, why is Ukraine so important in the world right now? If we're doing a class about modern forms of tyranny, why is Ukraine so important? Not that it's the only important place. Iran is important, China is important, Palestine is important, the United States are important. There are a lot of important places. But there's an odd way in which Ukraine seems to be at the axis of many other things in the 2020s. And it's also a bit odd, or at least it's interesting, it solicits our interest that Ukraine is at the middle of the Second World War. And likewise, it's also odd or interesting, or it solicits our interest, that Ukraine is crucial to the foundation of the Soviet Union and to the establishment of the Soviet state. There must be some reason why Ukraine is at the middle of all of this. So that's the overarching question, if you like, of this lecture. So I'm starting to give examples, or I'm going through the examples in reverse chronological order, and then when we're done with that, we'll do something else, which is the actual history of Ukraine. Okay, so the War of 1941 to 1945. In a very broad way, we can see a similar structure here. A structure where, on the one side, there's definitely a resource question, and on the other side, there's a very powerful ideology, which tends to explain why the people who actually live where those resources are not human beings, or not equal human beings. So in the War of 1941 to 1945, what are the Nazis after? In a very simple way, they're after resources. So I am ignorant of, so my kid's Canadian history class has only gotten up to the 1920s. So I don't, in a couple weeks I'll know how you were taught about the Second World War, but I don't know yet, sorry. So I like to start with like here's what you think you know, right? But I don't know what you think you know because I haven't read my kid's Canadian history textbook yet. We're only up to the 1920s. I did learn some interesting things about the First World War. Okay, but the essential, from the point of view of Nazi Germany and Hitler personally, the Second World War was essentially about Ukraine. And the reason why no one is taught that it's essentially about Ukraine is that Ukraine hasn't had a state for a very long time, and so on and so forth. But, and this is, by the way, a larger point, which I'm going to say now if I don't get to it at the end. The things that are most important are the things that you don't see, right? So the things that are most essential in history are very often the things that are hardest to see, right? Like mass murder or enslavement. It's the things that are most comfortable in one way or another are often the easiest things to see. The things that make it to history textbooks, right? The things that make it into familiar stories about your family or your clan or your tribe or your people or your nation. The things that are easy are the things that tend to rise to the surface. The things that are important are often the things that are hardest to see. And that's a general principle which applies very well to Ukraine in the 20th century. Okay, so The reason why Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union was Ukraine. And the reason why Ukraine were the resources. Secondarily, in order to get to the oil of Azerbaijan, you had to go through Ukraine. And at the time, the oil in the Caucasus was extremely important in world oil supply. So the secondary goal was getting through the south of Ukraine to the Caucasus and controlling the Caucasian oil fields. The primary goal was the black earth of Ukraine. So the soil of Ukraine, which is the most fertile in the world, or among the most fertile in the world, the Nazi idea was that if we control this soil, then we become a global superpower, we are able to feed ourselves, we'll have huge surpluses. So this is, at one level, very clearly a resource war. But at another level, this is a war also of ideology, in which Hitler also has a very clear idea why he's going to be able to control Ukraine. And the reason he thinks he's going to be able to control Ukraine is a certain worldview which has to do with the Jews. So Hitler has a kind of global anti-Semitic view, which again, this is going to be in the reading. I'm going to come back to it if it's not clear. But the essence of this view is something like this. The normal condition of the world is extreme Darwinian competition. Again, this is not me, this is Hitler, okay? So like, don't like be splicing this out of context and like, you know, putting me on TikTok or whatever. The normal condition of the, or whatever you kids use these days. The normal condition of the world, says Hitler, is unlimited ruthless competition among species for resources, for habitat, with the German word for which is Lebensraum. And for Hitler, a race, a human race, is just like a species. So we are divided up into races. We're as different from one another as, you know, baboons are from butterflies. We should be, he didn't use that example, but he used other colorful examples. We are very different from each other. We should be struggling for resources. So in Hitler's view, like as I look out at you, what we should definitely not be doing is all be together at one university, learning things together. We should be dividing up into various racial groups, and we should be killing each other in order to have food. That's Hitler's basic view of how the world is supposed to work. Why doesn't the world always work like that? Wouldn't that be beautiful, says Hitler. That would be natural, says Hitler. These are the first couple chapters of Mein Kampf. This is the way things are supposed to work. Why do they not work that way? Why do we observe other kinds of human behavior? Why are people not necessarily aware that they belong to one race and they should be exterminating other races? That is because we have ideas. We have ideas like, I don't know, like class solidarity, or the rule of law, or the state, or Christianity. We have various ideas which allow us to see other humans as human. And that's terrible, says Hitler. That is unnatural. That is perverse. That should not be happening. And there's only one way that such a terrible thing could be happening, says Hitler. Again, this is the beginning of Mein Kampf. And the way that it happens is the Jews. So what the Jews do is they behave in not in a subhuman way. That people say that, but it's misunderstanding. It's more that they behave in a kind of supernatural way. What the Jews do is, again, this is Hitler. What the Jews do is they renounce claims to territory, which is unnatural. We should all just care about territory. They renounce claims to territory, and instead they try to control everyone else through their minds. So the Jews put into circulation all these ideas about Christianity and loving thy neighbor, or capitalism and having contracts, or working class revolution and proletarians of the world uniting, the rule of law, me being a subject and you being a subject of the rule of law. All of these things are Jewish ideas, says Hitler. And these ideas might seem different to you. You might think Christianity and capitalism and Marxism are different ideas. Hitler thinks they're all the same idea, because all of them fundamentally have at their root the notion that you and I are human beings, as opposed to members of races. That there's some form of mutual recognition, right? Respect, empathy, whatever it might be, rather than animal competition for resources. Okay, so the Jews have this magical power to get these ideas in circulation, right? And that explains, and so the important thing is, Jews give up territory, says Hitler, on a limited scale, but what they're after is control of the entire world. So they use these ideas, they apply these ideas in different times and places. In America, it's capitalism. In Britain, it's capitalism. In the Soviet Union, it's communism. Doesn't really matter. It all comes out to the same thing. Okay, and that, by the way, is how Hitler explains that, the disastrous situation that Great Britain and the United States of America and the Soviet Union are all fighting against Germany at one time, because it's the Jews in all three places. But the fundamental ideological conclusion of all this is that if the Jews control things mentally, you can undo all of this physically. So if the Soviet Union, and this is what Hitler says, is constructed on the basis of Jewish mind control, then it's not going to be physically very difficult to resist. And so then he goes through various metaphors, like a giant with feet of clay or a house of cards or whatever. But the idea is that as soon as he hits the Soviet Union in 1941, it's going to collapse because it's all based on Jewish mind control. And as soon as the Jews won't fight, they'll run away. And as soon as they run away, the barbarians who inhabit the Ukraine will very happily accept Nazi imperial rule, because horrible and exploitative and murderous though it's going to be, it will still be better than Jewish mind control. Again, I'm just paraphrasing what they say. So so you see what I'm coming to. This is the basic theory of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a result of a certain kind of Jewish spell, which persuades people that they belong to a working class or something. As soon as you apply physical force, that magic spell will break down, and people will go back to being the races that they naturally were before. And, says Hitler, the Ukrainians, so this is where the subhuman bit comes in. The Ukrainians are subhumans. They will be very happy to accept the mastery of Germans. These are actual examples. We will put a radio on a pole in the middle of a village, and then the Ukrainians will dance around the pole, and that will make them very happy. Also, we will bring glass beads, and we will show them glass beads, and they'll be very impressed by the glass beads, and they'll be enchanted by the glass beads, and they will serve us. And meanwhile, we will starve and disperse tens of millions of them, but they'll still essentially be our slaves. That was the plan. Okay, you may see some weaknesses in the plan, but that was the plan for invading the Soviet Union. And we'll go into more detail about this in the reading. I just want to get it across now at a very general level, because it helps us to see a couple of very basic resemblances with the first example. And the basic resemblances are this: there's a resource component, right? Somebody wants something out of Ukraine, and there's a very drastic ideology which leads you to the view that you can control Ukraine, and that the people who are in Ukraine are not really people, right? So I'm not saying that Putin's view and Hitler's view are exactly the same, although certainly there's some overlap. What I am saying is that they have these two basic fundamental similarities. And you'll notice that, again, there's a question from the point of view of the invader: what's wrong with Ukraine? Right? And in the case of Putin, the answer is, what's wrong with Ukraine is that there's all this history, there are all these people who have done unpredictable things. There's all this stuff that happened between 862 and 2026, and it shouldn't have happened, it all has to be wiped out. For Hitler, it's, roughly speaking, similar. What's wrong with Ukraine is that Ukraine shows, again, this is Hitler, Ukraine shows that how terrible it is if people believe in any ideas. Right? They shouldn't believe in ideas, there shouldn't be ideas, we have to wipe out the ideas, and in particular, we have to wipe out the people who bring those ideas into the minds of others, and those are the Jews. And the connection between Ukraine and the Holocaust is something that I'm going to talk about in a few lectures down the line. Okay, so that's the second example, and again, I'm going to repeat the proviso. This is fundamentally an argument about how Ukraine is seen from the outside. All right. Third example is the foundation of the Soviet Union. And here again, we're going to be dealing with the same two basic forces that we were dealing with before, namely resources and narrative. The Soviet Union was essentially connected to Ukraine because of Ukraine's special resources. The Soviet Union was a project of transforming what was a country of nomads and peasants, or peasants and nomads, when it started, into a country of a working class. And in order to do that, it was very important. We'll talk more about this. We'll develop it further. It'll be in the next lecture. It'll be in Bloodlands. But in order for this to happen, the rich black earth, the soil of Ukraine, has to supply a surplus, which we can sell for hard currency, but which we can also use in order to invest in the mines and the factories and all the things we need to have a modern economy. So there's a resource story, but as in the other cases, the resource story is connected to an ideological story. It's connected to how the world, it's connected to a deep idea of how the world actually works, which we discussed last time. The way the world actually works is this. Changes in the means of production bring about different classes. Those different classes, again, this is not me telling you how the world actually works, okay? This is me paraphrasing Marx and then Lenin. The way the world works is that there are changes in technology. The changes in technology lead to different sorts of social arrangements and different dominating classes. At a certain point, modern industrial technology throws up a very small capitalist ruling class, which alienates the workers, both in the sense of immiserating them, but also in the sense of making them, estranging them from their own bodies, estranging them from the kinds of creatures they actually are. And what's special about capitalism is that it does that everywhere and almost all at the same time, which leads, says Lenin, to the conditions for a world revolution. Even, says Lenin, if this industrial capitalism isn't present everywhere in exactly the same way, we can just test it by having a revolution. If the revolution works, then we can go forward. And, says Lenin, if this succeeds, it proves that the basic analysis is correct. For a number of reasons, many of them contingent and interesting, Lenin and his comrades do succeed in 1917. They do carry out what they call a revolution. And then they find themselves facing a very tricky problem, which is that if you know how history works, okay, so I'm not gonna push this point too far, but there is a kind of mirror image resemblance here between Lenin and Putin, where Putin knows how the past worked. He doesn't have to investigate it too closely. He knows how it worked, right? Lenin knows how the future is going to be. Putin knows what the last 1,000 years were. Lenin knows what the next 1,000 years are going to be. And in each case, I assume you didn't wake up this morning and with a thought of what the next 1,000 years are going to be like, or what the last 1,000 years were, because there wasn't time to have enough coffee to get yourself to that level probably before class started. But it was just a pause. You could laugh, you don't have to laugh. If you want to laugh, that's fine. It was just a pause. It was an empty pause, and you filled it. That was nice. Okay. But so there's a kind of family resemblance here, and you can in a rough. It's just a rough way of thinking about this. But if I know what's going to happen in 1,000 years, and that thing or let's just say 100. If I know what's going to happen in 100 years, and that thing in 100 years is a beautiful, perfect end of history, in which everyone returns to their own essence, and we're all joyful and happy, and every realm of our lives, is perfect in every way, then naturally I might have to do some terrible things right now because we're going to get there, right? Very roughly similarly, if I know that in the past there was a perfect zone of innocence before anything actually went wrong, it's not surprising that I would do terrible things right now in order to restore that sense of the past. Okay, parenthesis concluded. So Lenin faces a problem, which is that he's had his revolution. We talked about this last time. He's had his revolution, but the world doesn't come along. The world doesn't come along. And Professor Shore will talk about this in the next lecture as well. So he's had his revolution, but the world doesn't come along, which means that you have to create what they end up calling socialism in one country. And the only obvious way to do that is to take Ukrainian resources and distribute them among the rest of the country, also take Ukrainian resources and sell them over the Black Sea around the world. We'll talk about this in a full lecture, but that particular idea leads to the starvation of about 4 million human beings in Ukraine in 1932 and in 1933. So what we have here, though, is a third example of roughly the same issue, right? A third example in which Ukraine is seen from abroad, or in this case, not from abroad, but like from the Moscow center. It's seen as a place which is crucial for the fulfillment of some kind of big world story. And somehow controlling the resources of Ukraine is also an element of making that world story happen. There's a story which should be happening, and it's not because the wrong people have hold of Ukraine, okay? So then I just want to repeat now the three underlying issues here, which I hope I've gotten across, but which I think are worth emphasizing. The first is, it's really simple, but the sheer presence of Ukraine in these larger histories. The things that I've just talked about, the war between Russia and Ukraine, the Second World War and Nazi Germany and Nazi crimes, the Bolshevik Revolution, the foundation of the Soviet Union, these are all very, very large-scale historical events. For any understanding of the modern world, including one of totalitarianism, which is our goal. In all of these, Ukraine is very present, right? That's the very simple point. Ukraine is present. But in all of these, if you're not careful, Ukraine might not seem to be present. It takes a little bit of effort sometimes to find Ukraine because the very reasons which are given the big world story, which is attractive, even if you dispute it, right? Even if you engage with it in a hostile way, the big world story is all about making Ukraine invisible, explaining why Ukraine shouldn't have been in there in the first place, explaining why even if though there might seem to be Ukraine or Ukrainian people or Ukrainian individuals, they're not really there or they're something else. And so the first thing I want to get clear is that Ukraine is present in these historical events, and the second is that Ukraine very often can seem to be absent because the big stories that are told around these various projects are all about making Ukraine seem smaller or less important than it actually is. And the third thing that I wanted to get across, and this is just a very simple thing, is the crucial difference between object and subject, which is implicit in what I just said. The way that many big stories work is that they allow the person who's telling the story to be the only subject. So the person who's telling the story is the only one who has any agency, any power, any discretion over what matters and what doesn't matter. Everyone else becomes objects in the story, like rocks in the field. And a story which is like that is not history. It may be powerful. It may work in politics. It may be very persuasive. It may even fill up history books, but it's not history in the normal sense of history. History contains those stories, and it has to contain those stories because those stories are part of what makes the world move. Stories about the past, or in the case of Lenin and the Soviet Union, stories which are about the past and how it leads to the future. These big stories are factors in history. They are things that matter in history, just like the flow of a river matters. They matter, but they're not the same thing as history. In history, in actual history, there would be many, many different focal points, as many as possible, many, many different subjects, and not just the subject of the person who is able to tell the story, whether that's Putin or whether that's Hitler or whether that's Lenin or Stalin. So what I want to do in roughly the second half of this is to start again and do everything in a different way, not starting from the present, but starting from the deep past, not starting from how we know things are going to turn out, but rather from how things actually did turn out, which is wildly different always. It's a good thing about the human condition that whether, like, this is a big reveal coming up, whether you're looking at the past or the future, things don't turn out the way you expect. And it is literally just as true of the past as of the future, because we all think we know things about the past, and upon more serious investigation, things almost always turn out to be very different than what we thought, which is one of the reasons why history, if you do it seriously, is enjoyable. Okay, so what I'm going to do here now is switch gears and move into the second part of the lecture, where we're just going to talk about stuff that actually happened in Ukraine. All right, so if this is not your thing, like, then you can like tune out at this point. I should have given you that warning in the first part of the lecture too. These are long lectures, you know, like if you can't do it for all 2 hours, I understand. Like, you have to pick an hour. I'm kidding. You have to pay attention the whole time. That was a joke. I was getting a little uncomfortable because people were like leaning forward like, oh, is that true? Can I just like pay attention for half? No, you can't just pay attention for half. That was a joke. You got to pay attention the whole time. What I'm trying to signal here is that we're shifting modes now, and we're going to do something very different, which is we're going to go way back, and we're just going to talk about some things that happened. And these things that happened, this is important, they don't necessarily point in any direction, right? So if I talk, as I'm about to talk, like if I talk about a mammoth tusk that was decorated in a labyrinth pattern by people on the territory of what's now Ukraine in the Ice Age, and, you know, 22,000 years after that, Ukrainian modernist artists were inspired by this sort of pattern, which maybe they were. The mammoth tusk thing is true. We're changing gears now. Mammoth tusk. Got to write down mammoth tusk. It's going to be on the test. Mammoth tusk. Okay, it's not necessarily. Mammoth tusk is probably not going to be on the test. I answered your question wrong. There are going to be a bunch of essays, but before that, you're going to have to like do a multiple choice. Which one is the Ukrainian mammoth tusk? We're going to do that. The Ukrainian one will be the one that has the beautiful art on it, and the other ones will just be incredibly boring. All right. So we're going to start off really easy. We're going to get like free 5 points, and then we're going to move. I'm just wondering what you're writing down right now. It's like Snyder tells 21st inappropriate joke in lecture. Okay. So, all right. So where were we? So what we're gonna do. So the point is that, okay, it's true that there were mammoth tusks, and it's true that they were decorated, and it's true that there was prehistoric art in Ukraine from 22,000 years ago. That's all true. The little point I was just trying to make is that the fact that that was true doesn't determine that I'm here talking about it right now, or that 20th century artists might have been inspired by it, right? The thing, when you go through history, one thing after another, you're not saying that these things had to lead to where we are now, right? So this is an important difference between how history is done and the kinds of stories I was telling, which all in their various ways have a strong element of what we call determinism, where you think you can be pretty confident about what's going to happen. When we start from the deep history, it helps us to understand a basic point, which is that although there are forces, and we can sometimes chronicle those forces, and there are trends and there are patterns, things aren't predetermined. There's an awful lot of room for chance, for the unobserved, and even for the downright unpredictability. Okay, so one thing which doesn't change much in the period of history and accessible prehistory is the shape of the country. And the shape of the country, this territory north of the Black Sea, is very important. And this is like, we should probably include this in the materials for the class, but if we didn't, or if we haven't yet, have a look at a map. The very old-fashioned thing to say, I know. Have a look at a map, because the zone north of the Black Sea is unlike pretty much any other territory in the world in ways that are politically relevant. So the zone north of the Black Sea has the following features. And this is after the Ice Age recedes. Okay, I'm going to stop it with the Ice Age now. Like, I've done enough Ice Age. But, okay, maybe I haven't. There are only 5 zones in Europe where people could live during the Ice Age, and Ukraine was one of them. And in Ukraine, I love how the auditors are writing this down. Like, it's like, that's the spirit, people. Write down the stuff about the Ice Age. in the Ukrainian zones where people did live during the Ice Age, we do actually have interesting relics of people building shelters, which may be the oldest, as far as we know. Whenever you say something's the oldest, then somebody discovers something else the next day, but which may be the oldest human-constructed dwellings that we know about. So, interesting stuff. When the Ice Age recedes, the geography that presents itself is something which is more or less constant. There are big changes in the 20th century, but more or less constant, and there are just some features which I want you to grasp in a rough way because they'll help. The first is that Ukraine is open to the east. Okay? Open in the sense that the steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E, I had a very discouraging conversation with, I'm not even sure I should say this, with a very high-placed person at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, and I was talking about the steppe, and they were like, "What's the steppe?" Oh no, this is going to turn out worse than I thought. But the steppe means the open pasture with tall grass, which extends from southern Ukraine deep into Asia. That's one feature of Ukraine, that it's open to the east. And that means that nomads, pastoralists, people who move fast with the help of animals, periodically appear. That's one feature. Another feature of Ukraine is rivers that flow from north to south, a bunch of them. Starting with the Danube, going all the way to, let's say, the Don, which is now in Russia, and the Dnipro is the most important, running down through the middle, where Kiev is placed. The rivers run north to south is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that it means that Ukraine is also open from the north. Not as open as it is from the east, but open enough if you're a Viking and you don't mind portaging your boats for a while, right? So a very important development in the formation of Ukraine is going to be people coming from the north, especially the Vikings, who we're going to talk about a little bit more. But the rivers are also crucial because the rivers all take you to the Black Sea, which is a deep body of salt water in which almost nothing can live. But on the surface, it's interesting, on the surface it's a pool of fresh water because you have all these freshwater rivers flowing into it north to south from Ukraine. And that means that as soon as you have ships and ports, you can export from Ukraine to all over the world because the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean. So in the classical world, that's the whole world, but the Mediterranean empties into the Atlantic, right? So things from Ukraine can reach the entire world, and they do. So that's another reason why the rivers are important. Okay, third thing which is important about Ukraine is the structure of the land from north to south, where you start with forest steppe, and then you have steppe, and then you have sea. So if you can just imagine those three zones north to south, that will also help you a lot. The steppe part, especially after it's been irrigated in the 20th century, is incredibly fertile. And this is the last point which is important to know. And again, this is one of these longue durée factors. Like, it's not like the kind of thing which was constructed by a press release, last week. It is just the case that the soil of Ukraine is incredibly fertile. And that it's not that difficult to produce a surplus from this soil. And you've already seen how that surplus tends to fire the political imagination of people from the outside, because you think, okay, I could build a world empire from Berlin on the basis of this, or I could build a world transformative project from Moscow on the basis of this, right? So that fertility of the soil is just a brute fact, which also has these political or even ideological implications. So that's the first point, geography. And it's an old-fashioned point, but if you can get it in mind, it will help you with a lot of the rest of the stuff. Second point is origins of civilization. And by civilization, I mean something very specific, which is the creation of cities. So I don't mean like some of us are civilized and some of us are barbarians. What I mean is something very specific, which is the creation of cities. So large gathering points with structures where humans live. The normal story of where cities come from, as you might know, is Mesopotamia. roughly Iraq today, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. That's where we have started our story of civilization. It turns out that it's much more interesting than that. It turns out that the technologies, the Bronze Age technologies, having to do with agriculture and pastoralism. Pastoralism is does everybody know what pastoralism is? You have some goats, right? You have some, you take them with you, they move around, right? No, but is anybody a pastoral? Okay, sorry. You don't have to be a pastoralist, but the domestication of animals and the development of seed crops are the big technologies that I'm talking about. These technologies spread from the Near East around the Black Sea into the Balkans and into what is now Ukraine. And those technologies in the Balkans and in what is now Western Ukraine up to the Dnipro generate a different sort of, I'm going to call it civilization because of the cities. So Mesopotamia is famous. So like if you've read the Bible, like Mesopotamia has kind of a bad name. If you're more of a Greek classic orientation, like the Mesopotamians are the ones who were very repressive, and they had the walled cities, and and we as the Greeks have gone way beyond all of that. But the Mesopotamians provide a powerful image of what a city is like. It has walls. It has central concentrations of power. It has a temple where possibly very terrible things happen inside. There are a pantheon of gods that are associated with the various competing cities. But contemporary to that, and actually a little bit earlier in what is now central Ukraine, about halfway between Kiev and the Black Sea, around not far from the town of Uman, there were also very big cities. Tens of thousands of people, which by the scale, we're talking about 6,000 years ago. So by the scale of 6,000 years ago, tens of thousands of people is a lot of people. I mean, for comparison, Rome at its peak was about 500,000. So tens of thousands of people 6,000 years ago is a lot. But these cities were of a different nature. They were built of dirt and wood, not of stone. There were no walls on the outside. There are no visible temples or centers of power. And this is sort of the charming part, around a broad avenue in the middle, the houses were built in semicircular rows, which allowed neighbors to visit neighbors and people to be in contact. Okay, so we can't say we know what this all means, right? Especially because unlike the Mesopotamians, the peoples of Ukraine from 6,000 years ago didn't have writing, or 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000, didn't have writing. And so we don't have written traces of any of this. But it was clearly something different. And the reason why I mention this is that there are a lot of reasons. Like, it's just interesting to know that the oldest cities in the world were from Ukraine. Almost nobody knows that. And again, when you say something's the oldest, like 3 weeks from now, somebody will use LiDAR and discover some like wooden city in Amazonia. But no, it's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting thing about high tech. So like, I know I've been hard on tech in this class, but tech is really useful for things that happened like 7,000 years ago. I mean, with respect to the present, unclear. But with respect to 7,000 years ago, absolutely, tech is extremely useful. Not least because, and this is actually true, because in traditional archaeology, it basically has to be built of stone. But in contemporary archaeology, with advanced carbon dating and with LiDAR and other things, you can find cities which had been invisible before. And it turns out, and this is really interesting, that there are prehistoric cities all over Latin America and all over Africa, which we didn't know about. And we're literally discovering them like every few months, which is very cool. But so far, the oldest ones are still in Ukraine. Okay, that may change, but so far, but what's interesting about this is that in a Western civilization paradigm, this is one thing which is interesting. The story is that Mesopotamia had cities, but they were very repressive. And then the Greeks also had cities, but they were less repressive. Look, there were citizens. And then in the Renaissance, we discovered all the good things about the Greeks, and we made them even better, right? And then we moved on to democracy. And that story is called the story of progress. okay? And on that unilinear story of progress, and what I'm saying now, I'm basically stealing from a book called The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wingrove, which has some interesting ideas. But on that, and this is one of the ideas that I think they have absolutely right. On that story of progress, you think, hey, the present isn't that bad, right? Like it's way better than ancient Mesopotamia, right? So like, and so like if on the story of progress, which goes like this, right? There's just one line. Mesopotamia, Greece, Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, you know, whatever it is we have now. And you think, okay, well, there's only one line, and the line's going up, so, you know, this is as good as it gets, like this is fine, right? But what if history wasn't like that at all? What if there isn't just one line? Like, what if there wasn't just ancient Mesopotamia, like this, but what if there were towns in Ukraine which didn't have a whole lot of human sacrifice and you know, which didn't have massive inequality? What if there were towns in Ukraine where instead of an increasingly patriarchal cult of gods, you had hundreds of little apparently female, although the gender was very fluid, I've got to say, apparently female deities, right? What if there are all kinds of different patterns? What if there's not one line, but there's all kinds of different stuff happening at every point? If that's true, then the story of progress is suddenly less convincing. And you think, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't just okay because it's better than all that bad stuff in the past. You think, well, maybe there was some good stuff in the past that we could have in the present, right? Okay, is that clear? Because it's a really important point. Like that's what having, and I understand that like if this were a class about other places in the world, I could play the same trick. But it's interesting that the cities in Ukraine are contemporary with the ones in Mesopotamia, or even a little bit older. And that gives you a first step to this idea that, maybe there are various kinds of origins of civilization. And therefore, various kinds of things are possible in history, and therefore in the present, and therefore in the future. Okay, that was point number 2, civilization. Point number 3, language. Language. So I am speaking, what am I speaking? All right. Everybody gets 1 point on the midterm for that. It's now like 99 free points. Everybody gets 1 point. I'm talking to the TFs right now. Everybody gets 1 point for that. And we're going to do the mammoth thing. That's another 5 points. Okay, and then the rest is going to be those questions. Okay, so language. Yeah, I'm speaking English. What kind of language is English? Okay, it has an overlay from the Normans of a lot of French and Latin, but it is a Germanic language. All right, what kind of languages are Germanic languages? Anybody else know anything besides like these people in the front row? Indo-European. 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 What other languages are Indo-European? Does anybody know? I'm not calling on you. What other languages are Indo-European? Polish is definitely Indo-European. There's like the Polish people are like, yeah, what? Farsi. Good, good. What else? Where? Okay, good. What else? What else? Okay. So the Indo-European languages are Indian languages, Iranian languages, Slavic languages, Romance languages, Germanic languages, Celtic languages, Greek, Latin. Those are all Indo-European languages. And Indo-European languages are spoken as a first language by about 45% of the world today. And if you include as a second language, you easily get over the majority of the population of the world because there are quite a few people who speak English not as a first language, but as a second language, not to mention French and Spanish and so on. So well over half the population of the world speaks Indo-European languages. Why? Okay, so there are easy contemporary answers having to do with the internet and then the American Empire and then the British Empire. But if we go all the way back, you get to what was once an incredibly hot question and is becoming a hot question again, which is where do these Indo-European languages come from? Because the difference between Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, to take the example which actually revealed this to everybody. The differences between Sanskrit and Greek and Latin are much smaller than you would expect, given how widely dispersed the languages are. The differences between English and Farsi are much smaller than you would expect, given the range, right? And so the Indo-European languages have commonalities, and those commonalities suggest, and this is the work of comparative philologists, the commonalities you can use following certain logics to bring you back to what the original language, which they call Proto-Indo-European, would have looked like. And so for the last 200 years, or a little bit longer, there has been an amazing debate about what the Proto-Indo-European homeland would be. Where did this all come from? Okay, you know where it's going to end, right? Because this is this class, but but pay attention anyway. So for the past 200 years, there was a long debate about this, right? And there were many interesting positions. It had positions based on the Bible, positions based upon ideas of national superiority, right? So the Germans, for a few years there, and you can guess which years, had the interesting idea that the Indo-European languages came from Germany, and that everybody who had achieved anything, whether it was in Persia or India or Egypt or anywhere in the world, they had sneakily come from Germany first. And you don't really have to know this, it's just kind of interesting. And it gives you a flavor of the extremes of this stuff, because naturally the idea that like everything comes from one place is very tempting, right? There's something very tempting, dangerously tempting about this. So the way the Nazis argued it was that this is seriously how they argued it. We're the most creative people. We're the source of all of Indo-European civilization. But where we're from, it's very cold. And because of the cold, we couldn't be very creative. But as soon as they let us out of Germany and we went to places like Egypt and India and Iran, we invented civilization there because it was warmer and we felt better about ourselves. And then we just kind of cut loose with everything. No, that was the view. And in that show, it's a little bit funny now, but that shows you the temptation, of course, right? Because everybody kind of wants to be the source of everything else. And if you're the source of everything else, well, maybe that means that you should be actually controlling everything else, which is, of course, the argument that was made for these people who took this Indo-Germanic route. Okay, we now have pretty good reason to believe, as a result, not just of the philology, but also the physical archaeology and ancient DNA studies, that the actual homeland of Indo-European was southern Ukraine and southwestern Russia. And that the people who originally spoke this language, and I want to be clear about something, by the way, when you talk about like a people, you don't mean like, oh, there's like some genetically precise thing, like some race. The people who brought Indo-European were a mixture. The way that you do ancient DNA is you don't say like, oh, look, here's like this pure thing, like gold. The people who brought Indo-European were themselves a mixture of multiple groups, which are they're then cataloged and named, and then they pass through Ukraine and they mix with other people, and then those are recatalogued and named. So I want to really strongly avoid the Nazi impression that there's like one race which was responsible for all this, because that's not how it works at all. But so you don't trace DNA by saying like this group had this DNA and like it still has this DNA 6,000 years later. That's not how it works. Okay, but ancient DNA is one of the sources of evidence which allows us to pin this down. So it appears that a group called the Yamna, Y-A-M-N-A, appeared a little bit after our friends, the Trypillia. I should have used this word earlier, Trypillia, T-R-Y-P-I-L-L-I-A. They're the ones with the goddess cults who founded these cities without walls. It appears that there was an encounter between Yamna pastoralists, that is people who had the technology of moving animals with them, and the Trypillia, who were farmers mostly, around the Dnieper River. And that this encounter, the nature of this encounter is highly disputed. There are the pro-Yamna people, which there's an extreme. The pro-Yamna people say, yes, we were very patriarchal and violent, and we admit it, and we just like came in and we rolled over your matriarchal, goddess worshipping, no wall building Trypillia people. Okay, that's one view. All right, and then there's another view which says, the pro-Tripilia view, which says, no, they never conquered us, like it was nothing like that. We actually burned down our cities ourselves because it was a kind of ritual that we had. It was a thing that we did. It had deep meaning for us. It wasn't them who burned down our cities. We just, every so often, we burned them down ourselves. And I'm not saying that's not, for all the colleagues that watch this, I'm not saying that's not true. And then there's a middle view, which I personally find more persuasive, which is that the Yamna hit these cities, they became untenable, but what followed was a merger, and the DNA evidence tends to confirm this, a merger of these two peoples and a merger of these two technologies, whereby a group of people with a disproportionate amount of DNA from the steppe, but bringing with them the technologies both of pastoralism and agriculture, moved very quickly through the rest of Europe, displacing everybody else. So if you ever ask yourself, like, why don't we know who built Stonehenge? Okay, I've just given you, so you didn't come into this class thinking you were gonna learn this, but this is why. Because the people who built Stonehenge were very quickly replaced by the people who came through Northern Europe bringing these technologies and this gene pool with them. Okay, and of course, the point about Farsi, right? That was one of the movements. There were a succession of movements which are probably associated with going westward, right? Languages in the Near East, Greek, Celtic, Latin, the Germanic languages, and finally Slavic. But there were also movements deep into East Asia, where you can find Indo-European languages even today, and more importantly, into what is now Iran and India. So these population movements went east, but also west. And so that's a first stage in a very, very important development, which is, I mean, not to exaggerate it, but the grammatical shape of the modern mind, at least for a lot of people, because grammar does have a great influence on how you think, and semantics do as well. And it just is a fact about the world that roughly half of us speak Indo-European languages as a first language. Whatever that means, it is just a fact. And there are many reasons why it's true, but one of the reasons seems to be that a relatively small group of people who spoke this kind of language emerged from the steppe in Ukraine about 5,000 years ago and afterwards, and were able by a combination of technology and culture to spread it pretty far around the world, including to the parts of Europe which later on would colonize much of the rest of the world. Right? So, I mean, the reason why Sanskrit exists has to do with a migration from Ukraine. The reason why English is widely spoken in India has to do with the British Empire. But ultimately, both of those developments take you back to the same place. Okay, so that was language. Next point is the classics. Okay, so in a classic view of history, which is probably familiar to some of you, the starting point or the focal point or the golden age would be the ancient Greeks. And so you might be asking yourselves, okay, what's the connection between the ancient Greeks and Ukraine? Anybody want to take a guess? It's not that I don't like you, I just want to involve other people. Yes. That is entirely true. The Greeks came to what's now Ukraine, the north coast of the Black Sea, and they established several cities. That is absolutely correct. We're talking about the years, the 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries BC. That's absolutely right. Anything else that one can imagine that would relate these two places? I mean, that's already a very important point, right? Because in the Western imagination, at least, Greece means Athens. And Athens is this very special kind of trans-historical spot, which does all these amazing things basically all by itself. And insofar as there's some kind of context, it's Greece, right? Maybe the Mediterranean a little bit, maybe going a little bit towards Asia Minor, but not the Black Sea. And the Black Sea was in fact incredibly important for the Greeks. They had towns there, they had cults there. Achilles lived for 1,000 years there. No, he did. Achilles was worshipped as a god in and around Olbia for 1,000 years. Okay, that's definitely going to be on the midterm, because I feel like nobody was paying attention. I'm going to slip that in there. What might the connection be, though? I've hinted at it pretty hard. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Byzantine Empire.
No, much later, much later, much later. That's thousands, no, yes.
Trade for foodstuffs?
Yes. So here's like, here's the founding, okay, one of the founding myths of Athens is you choose your god, right? You choose Poseidon or you choose Athena. And Athens is called Athens, so you know how the story is going to end. It's not called Poseidon's. So in the founding myth, I'm sure everybody knows this, but Athena and Poseidon are in a competition, and Poseidon shows up, and he's very powerful, and he takes his trident, and he spikes it on the rocks, and salt water comes gushing forth. And the Greeks say, that's very impressive, but we already have a lot of salt water. And then Athena comes, and she conjures up an olive tree. And the Greeks say, oh, olives, these are delicious. And also there's shade, and we like shade. We don't have enough shade. We have plenty of salt water, but not enough shade. Okay. The problem with that story is that you can't live just by eating olives. And the olives are the beginning of the story which leads you to where we are. Olives are a cash crop. It made sense to plant olives in an economy where you're trading with other places. What the Greeks did was they exported their own wheat production to other places, like the north coast of the Black Sea. And then they brought in, and then they used those cities, especially the ones on the eastern part, they used those cities to bring in the wheat, which they then lived on. So Athens was part of a much larger economic zone, which was connected to these cities, and these cities in turn were connected to a place called Scythia. So the Scythians and the Greeks are one of these confrontations where one side has lots of writing, the Greeks, and the other side has beautiful art and lots of archaeological material, but not so much writing. And so the Greeks tend to get to tell the story, and then we interpret the Greeks. But there's an interesting point about the Scythians. Okay, so this encounter, so these cities that are on the north coast of the Black Sea, these cities were Greek, but they had a Scythian hinterland, and the Scythian and the Greek elites tended to merge and eventually to become a little bit indistinguishable from one another, judging from some of the burial grounds. The Scythians and the Greeks arrived at the same time. The Scythians were one of these nomadic groups that could arrive. They were Iranian speakers, by the way, for those of you who are keeping score. The Scythians arrived as nomads from the east, and they hit the Black Sea at exactly the same time the Greeks were coming by boat. And so what you had was an encounter, which was sometimes more militaristic, sometimes more economic. With time, it was more cultural. And how does the culture appear? And I'm going to make this point because it hits on a little theme in Ukrainian history, which you see pretty often over the course of these thousands of years. One of the ways that it figured was in Greek art, where the Greeks, in their pottery and other art, they would have all kinds of portraits of Scythians because they encountered Scythians all the time. In their philosophy, in their literature, the Greeks always portrayed the Scythians as being very stupid, which is to be expected, and you have to kind of, when there's only one person doing the writing, you have to kind of take that into account. Another thing that the Greeks featured on their pottery, it was actually probably the most popular theme, were Amazons. You know what Amazons are? Okay. Are they real? I'm not looking at the first row. Are the Amazons real? Okay, you've said yes 3 times. That doesn't make them real, though. What you say 3 times isn't necessarily true. No one wants to commit on the Amazons being real. Okay, one of the reasons why the Amazons are awkward is that they seem to be in a realm of fantasy, of various kinds of fantasy, one could say. So a main theme in Greek art were the Amazons. Women with weapons and armor, on horses, with bows and things. Major theme in Greek art, maybe the most major theme. And interpreting this in the Freudian 20th century, what people did was they said, and this has a certain plausibility to it, they said, well, the Greeks had very repressed lives. They had these wives who they kept at home. They weren't very interesting. And so they fantasized about women who were dominant, women who could ride horses and shoot arrows. And sometimes an arrow isn't just an arrow, right? And so so the Greeks, because of the way they lived and the way they treated their own women, they dreamed of other women. And because of these dreams, they painted things on their pots. That was the way that we handled this evidence for quite a long time. All right. And then the archaeologists came in. And the archaeologists in southern Ukraine dug up some Scythian graves with people with armor and weapons. And amidst the people with armor and weapons, there were some people, about 20% of them, who were a little bit shorter than the other ones and who had a different pelvic structure. And these people were classified as the small warriors. And this is where, an example of where technology comes in and really helps history, because once we have the ancient DNA technology, we could then apply it to the remains of the small warriors with a different pelvic structure and establish that they were biological females. And then once you know that, then everything else sort of dawns on you and you realize, okay, the problem wasn't with, so to speak, the small warriors, and the problem was always with us, that the reason why the Greeks devoted so much space to Amazons was because they had everyday encounters with mounted female Scythian warriors, Amazons, who were in fact real people. There were Amazons. Roughly 1/5 of the Scythian warriors, judging by the archaeological evidence, were female. And it was the technology enabled that, right? Whether women take part in war tends to depend on the state of technology, but if you could ride a horse and make and care for and use a recursive bow, then you could kill men from long distances and try to avoid hand-to-hand combat, which they did often end up engaging in, but it was from a distance where the Amazons were most deadly. Okay, I mention this because not just because of the gender element, which is interesting, but also to balance the Greek story with the Scythian story. The Greek story never happens without the Scythians. Without the Scythian economic element, it never happens. And also the Greek culture, so much of it that we like or remember or talk about, doesn't exist without the Scythians either. There's a reason why Hercules and Theseus and Bellerophon and Achilles all had encounters with Amazons, because the notion of the powerful armed woman was a very important part of how the Greeks thought about themselves. It reflected their own reality, and that we didn't see that in the 19th and 20th centuries, or even in the 21st, reflects on us. I mean, it reflects on the Greeks in a certain way, but it really reflects on us more than anything else. Okay, so that's a very rough way in which the Ukrainian story changes the classical story. Fifth point, I think, is circulations. So after the Greeks, the next main interesting population to appear on the territory of what's now Ukraine were the Goths. And by the Goths, I don't mean like your friend who couldn't take this class because it was too early in the morning. I mean the actual the actual Goths, like the Germanic-speaking peoples who emerged probably from they emerged in the 1st century AD or so, around the Baltic Sea, and they immigrate to what's now Ukraine. And from the 2nd, or at the very latest, the 3rd century AD, they dominate the territory. They're not the only people there. There are still Scythians, lots of other Iranian speakers, but these Germanic-speaking Goths arrive and they control the territory for a few hundred years. They then have an interesting relationship with the Roman Empire. Many of them fight in Roman armies. They have territorial struggles around the Danube River, which is roughly the border between the Roman Empire and the Goths. They learn things from the Romans. One of the things they learn from the Romans is Christianity. So many of the Goths, we can't be sure how many, but many of the Goths convert to Christianity in the 4th century AD. So if anyone ever does ask you about the first conversion to Christianity in Ukraine, it's not the 10th century and Volodymyr, it's actually the 4th century. The Bible is brought by someone called, it's a great name, Wolfilla, it just means little wolf, right? So I know like while you're in university, you're probably not thinking about like having kids and you're not like, what am I gonna call them and stuff. But just remember Wolfilla, like little wolf, it's a nice name. Okay. Again, like I just try to give your brains a break every so often, right? Because I know as soon as I say having kids, your brains just turn off completely. Okay, but you can understand that when I say Wolfilla means little wolf, like that's not really surprising to you, right? That's the magic of Indo-European. Wolfilla is a Gothic name from 1700 years ago from Ukraine. And nevertheless, you don't have any trouble understanding what it means, right? If I say Wolfilla means little wolf, you're not the least bit surprised. Okay. So there was an interaction between the Goths and the Romans, which went badly in the late 4th century, when, again, remember, Ukraine opened from the east. In the late 4th century, the Huns appear, and the Huns drive many of the Goths across the Danube River. And once they're across the Danube River, they make all kinds of trouble for the Roman Empire. In various constellations, they kill a couple of Roman emperors, which is mostly a no-no. They sack Rome itself in 410. Later in the 5th century, a leader of one group of Goths, a man called Theodoric, is asked by the Roman emperor in Constantinople, essentially to take over the Western Roman Empire, which he does. These Goths are so impressive for a couple of reasons. And it has to do with the basic point about encounter in Ukraine. The Goths managed to come all the way down to Ukraine, where they encountered Scythians and they learned things from them. They never themselves became major mounted warriors, but they did learn how to fight on horseback. Then the Goths had a long encounter with the Romans, from which they learned various other fighting techniques. Then the Goths were conquered by the Huns. Okay, so you probably know, you know who the Huns are, right? The Huns are the people who threatened the Roman Empire. But the Goths were probably the major part of the Hunnic Empire in terms of the armed forces. The Goths sat for 100 years with the Huns in what's now Hungary. And during that time, the Goths learned more things, right? So the Goths who spread through Western Europe, as Central and Western Europe, as they're doing now, as I'm narrating, it's not that you had like one ethnic group with like one program. These people encountered Scythians, they encountered Romans, they encountered Huns, they learned things along the way, and by the 5th century, they were in control of the Western Roman Empire. And not long after that, a group of them was in control of southern France and founded the state which we now know as Spain. A group of Goths founded Spain. So there's a story about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And if you're a rise and fall of the Roman Empire kind of person, you tend to think, well, Rome was great, and then these terrible people came and they sacked it, and that was very bad. I'm obviously taking a different view, right? The view that I'm taking is that the sack of Rome and the subsequent rule of the Western Roman Empire by the Goths is an interesting example of something else, which is the migration of populations, the learning that accrues by way of encounter, the fact that Rome didn't actually ever fall. Like the notion of a fall is so attractive, right? Because first of all, it's visually attractive because you picture like all the monuments and things in Rome physically falling, right? And then you imagine the barbarians like dancing in the rubble. You know, it's an incredibly attractive image. It doesn't really happen like that. People sack cities, they do terrible things, but Rome never fell like that. The Goths had control of it for a while, and then Rome kind of fades out into the emerging West European states, the first of which is Spain. And Spain is founded by the Goths. Okay, so this story is a story of circulation. It's a story of the movement of peoples, in which Ukraine is a major part of the story, the central part of the story. It's also a story about what actually happens to Rome, which is that it's ruled by people who came from Ukraine for a while. It's also a story of the foundation of the first European Christian kingdom, which is Visigothic Spain, which is also founded by people who came from Ukraine. Now, the way that the story is never told like that, right? Like if you go to Museum of Spanish History, and I've checked, they never say, like, you know, by the way, we were founded by people who came from Ukraine. Which is a sort of banal thing, like it's just obviously true. The Goths came from Ukraine, everybody knows that. But nobody actually puts this together. And it's an example of a fundamental point I was trying to make. The things that are most important are often the things that are pushed aside. So in a history of Spain is about how like everybody who was in Spain was always already in Spain, and Spain. Except maybe, you know, there was a few centuries there where it was the Muslims, but Spain, right? Everybody does that, or the Europeans do that. So it's a story about Rome, it's a story about the emergence of medieval Europe, but it's also a story about circulation. So the Goths, they had stories, and those stories were in a Germanic language. And those stories had, they had heroes, male and female, quite a few female ones actually. And those stories, I don't have time to go into the details, but those stories then provide a foundation for English language poetry, like Widsith and Beowulf. Those stories then provide a foundation for Scandinavian stories, which then become famous about Scandinavian heroes like Sigurd, otherwise known as Siegfried, foundation for stories of Scandinavian gods. These stories, long after the Goths lose power in Italy and Spain, the stories remain. And the place where these stories get told, and from whence we have them, is Scandinavia. The Scandinavians pick up these stories, and this is the end of the circulation story. In an interesting way, they bring them back to Ukraine. So the Goths, the story of the Goths is roughly the 1st century to the 8th century AD. The story of the Scandinavians is roughly 8th century to 12th century AD. And that's the period of a Viking globalization. As you will know, because you learned it in school, this is when they founded Canada, right? Okay, good. Okay, they didn't, all right. But so the Vikings had a kind of first globalization in which they, as you know, I mean, in all seriousness, in which they did reach North America, they did reach Greenland, they colonized permanently, I mean, it's still there, Iceland. They reached North Africa. They founded multiple states in Western Europe. Their descendants invaded England from Spain. But most importantly for our purposes, they followed those rivers, those north to south rivers in Eastern Europe, and ended up in what's now Ukraine. And the circulation part, which is so interesting, is that when they arrived in Ukraine, when they arrived in what's now Ukraine in the 9th, 10th centuries, they brought with them Gothic stories, which had actually arisen in Ukraine in the first place. And I find that kind of remarkable. Like the images they had on the hilts of their swords, and the stories that they told on runes, had actually, some of them have their origins in Ukraine, and those stories had gone from Ukraine, through Italy, through Rome, into Spain, into Scandinavia, and then made the circle all the way back into Ukraine. But the Vikings are important for us. And by the way, I also want to make the point, the stories got more interesting as they spread. So when the Vikings come back to Ukraine, I don't want you to imagine that it was just Germanic people the whole time. The Vikings were, of course, speaking Germanic languages, but in order to get down to what's now Ukraine, they had hundreds of years long period of contact with Turkic speakers, Iranian speakers, Christians, Jews, and the Byzantine Empire, getting there, the Byzantine Empire. The result of which was that their Germanic stories were very interestingly enriched, so that they included some concepts that might be familiar to you, like Valhalla. So if you're a hero, this is where you go after you're dead, which is a Turkic idea, which the Vikings picked up, or Ragnarok, a final, you know what Ragnarok is, right? The final confrontation at the end of the world in which the gods, interestingly, lose and die. Ragnarok is pretty clearly a borrowing from Jewish and in a broader sense, Near Eastern stories. The Vikings gather a lot of, and the whole character of Odin, a fantastically interesting god of mystery, does not come from Germanic sources mainly. The Germanic Wodan is just like he leads the hunt. You know, he's not a terribly interesting character. But by the time you get to Odin, a guy who sacrifices himself on a tree for 7 days, gives away one of his own eyes for wisdom, always kills his best friends. By the time you get to Odin, you're at a much more complicated character, and that character is a result of the Vikings going down through Eastern Europe and encountering Turkic speakers, Iranian speakers, all kinds of other people, and gathering stories together. Okay, so, oh, and of course, that connects to us, right? Because these images of Odin and Thor and Viking myths, which we find appealing, maybe, or not, but in any event sell lots of movies for Marvel, those images come directly from this circulation. Okay, last point, and I'll bring you back up to the modern, is the period of Commonwealth and Empire. So I've tried really hard in this lecture to lean on the old parts of history. And the reason why I've done this is because I want you, first of all, just to like see the inherent interest of all of this. You know, even if it's not directly relevant to the 20th century, the origins of our languages and the origins of cities and the origins of stories, I hope are inherently interesting. But the other reason is that I just want to rebalance things a little bit, because the way we think about the past often depends upon people right now picking one point in the past and saying that point is where everything happened. So in the case of Putin and the present war, 2026 matters and 862 matters and nothing else matters. And I wanted you to see how many other things are just going on. And once you have a sense of that, then the notion that there are only 2 points in history and you can just draw a line between them just hopefully seems not just unconvincing, but kind of boring and absurd. But the other reason that I wanted to do it is that if you have some sense of all of this, then these themes that are 20th century themes are a little bit less surprising, right? So it's not so surprising that people want to negate a history which is very rich. It's also not so surprising that people want to exploit a territory which is very rich. It's not so surprising that a place which is the source of so many things, material and cultural, attracts counterstrikes, which are both material and cultural. So the very last thing I want to do before we're done is just to bring you up to the present. The last period is a period of commonwealths and empires. The Viking state, which is called Rus, is more or less done away with by the 13th century when the Mongols appear. Again, we're open to the east. So the Mongols, who like the Vikings, might have a bad name depending on your perspective. Like the Vikings, the Mongols were mainly interested in establishing trade routes, which they succeeded in doing. But along the way, they broke up what remained of the state of the Rus. For a couple hundred years, the main encounter in what's now Ukraine was between the Mongols and their successors and a state called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania picked up most of the pieces of what had been Rus and incorporated it. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in turn, merged first as a union of crowns and then as a formal union of territories in 1569 with the Kingdom of Poland. And so the territory which is now Ukraine was part of Lithuania or Poland-Lithuania from most of the territory, that is, some of it was under the Mongols and their successors, but most of it was under Lithuania or Poland-Lithuania from the 13th century until the 18th century. So 500 years, a relatively long period of time. The Russian factor comes in relatively late. The Russian Empire is one of the European empires that emerges in the 19th century, and it resembles the American one in the very specific sense that it moves chiefly across land rather than over water. The Russians, starting in Moscow, as a kind of post-Mongol state themselves, are able to find ways to make a lot of money with fur and other goods going across all the way to the Pacific. Having done that, they turn back around and destroy the Polish-Lithuanian state and themselves incorporate Ukraine. Which leads to the story, which then starts to become familiar, the story about how Ukraine had always been part of Russia. Russia, of course, was a very new entity from our perspective, and Ukraine and Russia had never existed at the same time, but now the imperial story from the 18th century and especially the 19th century becomes Russia and Ukraine were always together. And the Russian Empire, although in a less extreme form than these other empires I talked about at the beginning of the lecture, also takes advantage of Ukrainian resources from 1719, I think it is, or very early in the 18th century. The Russians have control of the Ukrainian ports and are exploiting the trade of Ukrainian grain in a monopolistic way. And then there's also an ideology, which again is a softer version of the ideology. It's an imperial ideology. Ukraine and Russia are always together. Ukrainians aren't really real. The center of our history is Moscow. So that gets us through the 19th century to the 20th century, where the lecture began. And when we get to the next lecture, we'll be running through a lot of this again through the 20th century, and then I will be repeating these themes that I talked about at the beginning. So I hope that this question, what is Ukraine, even if it hasn't been definitively answered, because you can't answer questions like this definitively, has turned out to be interesting in and of itself, I hope. But I also hope that the depth involved in this will get the modern questions, put the modern totalitarian questions in perspective and help us see them with a cooler eye. Thank you very much.